Can a single line in the regulations destroy years of work and leave Ferrari completely out of the title fight before the new engine era begins in 2026? The origin of this crisis that has exploded within the paddock and that has Ferrari in a state of alarm begins with a simple number, 16. That is the maximum value allowed in the geometric compression ratio for Formula One engines from 2026. At first glance, it seems like just another technical figure, part of the FIA's effort to make the engines more efficient, sustainable, and in line with the new environmental values of the sport. But behind that number lies an interpretation that has opened a rift between the teams, a rift that now threatens to upset the competitive balance for years. Compression ratio, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a measure of how much the air-fuel mixture is compressed in the combustion chamber before ignition. The higher this ratio, the greater the thermal efficiency of the motor, which translates into more power with less consumption. In the hybrid era, where every tenth counts, this relationship becomes a critical tool for winning races or losing them. Now, the new regulations establish that this ratio must not exceed 16:1. The interesting thing is how it is measured. The technical regulations indicate that the verification must be done at room temperature, under static conditions. That is, the engine is measured cold, outside its actual operating environment. This is where the genius and controversy of Mercedes comes in. What they have done is design an internal architecture with materials that expand when the engine reaches its actual operating temperatures on the track. These materials are not illegal. Neither does its thermal behavior. But its consequences are surprising. When heated, these parts reduce the effective volume of the combustion chamber, which increases the real compression ratio under racing conditions. In other words, the engine is still legal in the garage, but it transforms into something else on the track. This means that while all teams, including Ferrari, designed their power units to stay strictly within 16:1 under all conditions, Mercedes and then Red Bull built engines that on paper deliver, but in practice have a hidden advantage. That advantage, according to internal estimates shared by industry technicians, equals about 15 additional horsepower. In modern Formula One, that is an abyss. The most disconcerting thing about all this is not only the technical advantage but the legal audacity. The interpretation they are using is supported by a literal reading of Article C.5.4.3 of the regulations. The geometric compression ratio cannot exceed 16.0, but the verification method is in the hands of the manufacturers, detailed according to document FIF 1DOCC042. By not having an obligation to measure hot or under real operating conditions, Mercedes and Red Bull played a brilliant legal card that the FIA cannot reject without admitting that its own regulations have design flaws. This kind of approach is reminiscent of the gray areas that have marked the technical history of F1. Brilliant solutions that border on legality without crossing the line, at least not officially. But this time the impact is greater. This is not a flexible spoiler or a blown diffuser. This is the heart of the engine. Of an entire propulsion system that could dominate the grid without rivals having the slightest chance of replicating it in time. At Ferrari, the revelation was devastating. Until that moment, they believed they had found a balanced, efficient, legal, but also conventional solution. Its SF26 engine, developed under official parameters, did not contemplate playing with thermal expansion to alter its internal architecture. Not because they couldn't do it, but because they simply didn't know others were doing it. The news came as a betrayal. And not just a technical betrayal, but a political one. Because Mercedes would have maintained constant contact with members of the FIA during development, and that suggests that they could have had informal approvals to go down this path. But now, with the engines already in a critical homologation phase, the reality is brutal. Ferrari designed its power unit under a logic that will not be the dominant one. Its internal architecture cannot replicate the thermal effects of expansion because it was simply not designed to do so. Implementing such a system now, at this point, would mean completely rebuilding the combustion chamber, pistons, connecting rods, and altering the geometry of the engine block, which is technically and logistically infeasible with the current schedule. This is where the desperate element appears. Because Ferrari, which has traditionally been a defender of the regulatory status quo, is now forced to fight against it. They have sent formal letters to the FIA demanding a review of the regulations, supported by Honda and Audi, two other manufacturers that also respected the literality of the rule. The basis of his argument is simple, direct, and difficult to refute. Article C 1.5 of the regulations establishes that the car must comply with all regulations at all times during a competition. That includes real race conditions, not just the static check in the garage. Maranello says that allowing an engine to dynamically modify its compression ratio and exceed the regulatory limit during track operation is equivalent to allowing mechanical cheats that circumvent technical control. In harsher words, if an engine delivers more than allowed thanks to a thermal engineering trick, then it is not legal during the race, regardless of whether it appears to comply in the garage. The precedent that Ferrari fears is not only sports, it is ethical, and it's historic. In 2019, when the FIA investigated its own engine for manipulation of the fuel flow sensor, the sanction was not public, but it was devastating. A loss of performance that lasted almost 2 years. And the stigma of cheating remained hanging over the Scuderia. Today, Ferrari looks at that mirror, but from the other side. This time they are the ones harmed. This time they are the ones demanding technical justice. But they do so from a position of political inferiority, because the FIA has already given alarming signals. The governing body recognizes that the compression ratio verification method is flawed, but also admits that changing the rules now would open the door to legal disputes with manufacturers who have already invested millions under the current interpretation. And among those manufacturers is Mercedes, which would have maintained an open communication channel with the FIA since the start of the 2026 engine project, receiving the green light at each critical step. It is an unequal battle. Ferrari is trying to block a lead before it becomes irreversible. But everything indicates that the FIA will opt for a political solution, allow the use of this technology in 2026, under the excuse that the verification method is legal, and promise a new form of direct measurement for 2027, this time using internal sensors in the combustion chamber. The problem? By then, the damage will already be done. Ferrari, Honda, and Audi would enter 2026 with a structural disadvantage of up to 15 horsepower. And if the hybrid era has taught us anything, it is that this type of deficit cannot be corrected with ailerons or energy maps. It is a burden that conditions the entire season, the whole strategy, every possibility of victory. Internally, Project 678, code name for SF26, has become a source of anguish. Engineers are divided. Some ask to rebuild from scratch, even at the cost of losing time. Others believe they must stand firm and force a change from the FIA, even if it means taking the case to legal proceedings. But in the meantime, the clock is ticking. The 2026 season does not wait, and the rivals already have their arsenals ready. Ferrari is stuck at a crossroads. They did the right thing, and they could pay the ultimate price for it. The conflict unleashed by the compression ratio is not just a technical dispute. It is a political and legal time bomb that threatens to undermine the very credibility of the International Automobile Federation. The FIA is caught between two worlds, that of the manufacturers who faithfully adhered to the Ferrari, Honda, and Audi regulations, and that of those who found an alternative reading that gave them a secret advantage for Mercedes and Red Bull. Any decision he makes now will have consequences that could extend for years and affect not only the championship, but the legitimacy of the entire Formula One regulatory system. The paradox is chilling. If the FIA decides to officially validate the use of thermal expansion materials that alter the compression ratio during the race, it would be implicitly admitting that the cars do not need to comply with the technical regulations beyond the moment of the cold inspection. That would break a sacred principle in the sport. The car must be legal at all times of the weekend. Not only when he is stopped in the box, not only when measured with static instruments, at all times. Accepting otherwise is opening a very dangerous door. It means authorizing technologies that, while legal on the surface, are designed to behave differently when no one is watching. It would, in effect, institutionalize the trap. But if the FIA backs down, if it modifies the regulations now and requires that the compression ratio be also measured in real operating conditions, that is, hot, with dynamic sensors or combustion chambers equipped, then it puts in check the manufacturers that have already invested in the design and production of power units completely built under the original interpretation. There is a risk that these teams, especially Mercedes, will respond with legal action for changing the rules of the game when the engines are already in the validation phase. And that, for the FIA, is an equally catastrophic scenario. Because the federation not only regulates sport, it must also protect its legal integrity. It cannot allow itself to be perceived as an unstable entity, capable of giving in to media or political pressure without a clear legal framework. And there is an even darker dimension. If the FIA accepts the thermal solution now, it sets a precedent that could incentivize the development of new technologies that are hidden under specific operating conditions. Technologies designed not to innovate within the law, but to escape from it. It is a dangerous path that can lead to the technical collapse of the regulations. In short, the FIA is faced with a classic dilemma. If it acts now, it risks legal consequences. If you don't act, you lose moral authority. And in both cases, you lose something even more important: the trust of the teams, the engineers, and the fans who still believe that Formula One rewards the best car, the best driver, and the best idea, not the best trap. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.